All right, gentlemen, let's change gears here. George, again, in the afterglow of the exit from Afghanistan, the humiliating one at that, there's a lot of talk about a new war on terror, the necessity of it. Others are creating threat inflation. And you brought to my mind something quite interesting that very few people really want to consider is, was there really ever a war on terror? Because it seems in retrospect over the last 20 years, it's quite selective because, as I said in my introduction, evacuation of Afghanistan, then why stay in Syria? George?
Oh, that's exactly the issue, because to the extent there ever was a war on terror, that was over and done with by December 2001, when basically the Americans had thrown out the Taliban, pushed out al-Qaeda, arrested all these people, taken them to Guantanamo Bay. What did any of that have to do with the March 2003 invasion of Iraq? Because Saddam Hussein, he was no friend of al-Qaeda, despite all the nonsensical propaganda from New Yorker and Cheney and Bush. He was no friend of al-Qaeda. And then we had the wars on Libya and Syria. These governments were very much opposed to the jihadism. I mean, they arrested jihadis. They had no time at all for them. Or Yemen. And then so really what we've had is actually a war on the very governments that actually fought against Islamism. We've had a war against these nationalist, secularist governments, all wrapped up in this phony baloney talk about a global war on terror. And this goes on to this day. I mean, if you ask, why exactly are Americans in Syria? Oh, well, we're fighting ISIS. Well, as we've seen a very interesting article this week by Aaron Mate. He points out there's been no fighting against ISIS, none, not one military mission against ISIS at all. So this has now become a rationale for continued American interventions, military presence around the world, that they are fighting ISIS when in fact they're doing nothing of the sort.
Well, and of course, if we look at Idlib, I mean, the way it's being Idlib is being approached in Syria is that you distill it down to there's good ISIS and bad ISIS. There's good Al Qaeda and bad Al Qaeda. I mean, the think tankistan, they tie themselves up into pretzels here because it doesn't make any coherent sense, and that's why George's premise that there never was a war on terror is absolutely correct, because it's very selective, and you use ISIS and Al Qaeda when you need them. Is that? Did I distill it down to the purest form? Go ahead, Dima.
Well, I'm sure some people are going to accuse us of being conspiracy theorists, like, how come you say the United States didn't fight ISIS? Well, I'm going to use here only the facts that are kind of mentioned as facts by Western press, okay? Out of 19 terrorists who committed the 9/11 terrible terrorist act, 15 were from Saudi Arabia. Okay, one guy was from Egypt. Two others were from Yemen and Tunisia. The United States did not attack Saudi Arabia. It did not attack Tunisia. It did not attack Egypt. It attacked Iraq and Afghanistan, even though none of these guys was from Iraq, Afghanistan, or from Libya. So where is the logic here? And I understand why people are fond of conspiracy theories, because the Western vision of Russia as an aggressive country is just one big multi-branched conspiracy theory, right? So people have no trust in the official information, and that's why sometimes they think up theories of their own. I'm going to stick to facts here. I think George is absolutely correct when he says that this was not a war against terror when Bush invaded Afghanistan and Iraq. I think that even in the United States now, you can read in The Spectator in an article by Daniel McCarthy, the war on terror was a war of religion. In the modern sense, I think the people in Washington and the people in Brussels, by the way, genuinely believed that they can force on Afghans their new ideology, ultra-liberal ideology. I mean, another nice headline from The Spectator: did gender studies lose Afghanistan for us? They did, because there is no word for gender in Pashto or in Urdu or in Dari, the languages spoken in Afghanistan. In fact, there is no such word in Russian, But these people kept pushing their ultra-modern, ultra-liberal ideas in the societies that were absolutely not ready for them. And that inspired terrorists, because, look, the United States and the EU invaded Yugoslavia, and the Yugoslavs did not commit a single terrorist act. They tried to defend themselves, speaking to the press, writing books. They were silenced, This was not taken into account. So I think one of the reasons why there are so many terrorists is because you cannot have your voice heard in the Western media if you are already an alternative voice.
Well, I mean, but George, it gets down to the war on terror is actually a pretty good grift, right? I mean, you identify a threat, and then you prepare for it. You annihilate it, attack it, and then you get blowback, and then you start all over again. I mean, it's pretty convenient, isn't it? I mean, and then again, it's very, very selective. We don't like that. These jihadists are harmless. Actually, they're helpful. These are against us. But I mean, it's all about labels, isn't it? Because as we've all pointed out here, maybe not saying in exact words, there's no coherent theory of the war on terror. It doesn't exist.
No, that's right. And, by now, everyone's already found the talking point. Yes. The Americans were the initial supporters of the jihadis in Afghanistan in the 1980s. And everyone's on that page. But it went on. It didn't just end magically in 1989. America continued to support jihadis. They did this in Bosnia. I mean, Richard Holbrooke, in his account of the war in Bosnia, boasted that the United States was shipping in jihadis into Bosnia and said, it was the same as when we were backing Stalin against Hitler in World War II. So that's been their idea. And we know that they were also supporting the jihadis in Chechnya. And what are they doing in Syria? They are absolutely determined to prevent the fall of Idlib. When it seemed in 2018 that the government of Assad is going to launch an offensive against Idlib, the Americans under Trump threatened to bomb Damascus if they did that. So they've been doing this all the time. They've been playing this little game of backing the good jihadis, which we can unleash against the governments that we don't like, as opposed to the bad jihadis who do bad things to us. So, I mean, the Americans were caught by surprise. Bin Laden, he was our man, and he goes and launches this attack on us, the ungrateful so-and-so.
Yeah, Dima, one of the pathetic things in watching American media, particularly on the 20th anniversary of the events of 9/11, is that, there's a general agreement that the war in Afghanistan had to come to an end. I think that's across the board, okay? Of course, there are neocons that wanted to go on forever. But embedded in the commentary and the narrative about 9/11 is that it could happen again. And there are still groups in Afghanistan resisting the Taliban, and that's that narrative we heard. We heard that 20 years ago. Maybe we need to help them. I mean, there's this temptation of repetition constantly, and of course there will be plenty of people with vested interest saying, yeah, that might be a good idea, because, we can start from scratch, start all over again, okay, because the Taliban are back, okay? And again, there's no coherent understanding on how to fight this so-called war on terror, because no one, at least the powers that be, never take on a one-off basis. You have to sell this entire bill of goods to the public for it to succeed. Go ahead.
Well, I have my own collection of absurd statements from not only American media, but American presidents, like Trump said, we killed that guy, al-Baghdadi. Where did you kill him? In Idlib, which is supposed to be the stronghold of Democrats resisting Assad's terrible government. Actually, Assad could have killed him before, the same story with Reagan. We admire the courage of the Afghan people who resisted a modern Soviet army with just some, submachine guns. Well, it is right. Now we have that same situation. Afghans with submachine guns resisted an even more modern army, the American and the European armies in Afghanistan. Well, I think it was not the American people or the European nations that lost the war in Afghanistan. It was the ideology, which just didn't take into account any peculiarities of people living in Afghanistan. I mean, look at nature. In nature, we have all the species coexisting. The fact that mammals are more developed than reptiles doesn't mean that reptiles have to die out. In the same way, in human society, you cannot force the ideas which are now accepted in the United States and Western Europe and which are very, very dubious. You cannot force them on a society in South Asia.
Well, I got bad news for you, Demon. Let me go to George. You're right. It didn't work in Afghanistan. Now the powers that be are trying it on half the American public. Okay, so they succeed. They failed in Afghanistan. Let's try it now in the West. I mean, you're seeing this particularly in the United States of the unwashed, the rubes. Okay, the Demon. You're right. The ideology died in Afghanistan, but it hasn't died in the West. George.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And that is what is happening now in the United States, where under Biden, the war has been brought home. The war has been brought home against the great unwashed, the so-called white supremacists, the unvaccinated. The names change, but they mean the same people, the deplorables in Hillary Clinton's phraseology. And of course, they're waging this war against the renegade European countries. I mean, it's going to Orban's Hungary, Poland. So it's this liberal ideology that is now targeted against the vast mass of humanity that just doesn't accept it. And this is indeed why the global, whatever one calls it, the global war on terror, which is just simply a kind of this liberal ideology, is still prevalent. And 9/11 and all this talk about Afghanistan, it's still a menace to society.
It's a menace to society, and one thing is for sure, gentlemen: it needs an enemy. Without an enemy, it doesn't exist. It will have no reason to exist.